Welcome back to another edition of the CanesInSight podcast, brought to you by Canes. So we're back at the FRM studios. D, it's been a while. I've been on the road. Was on the road for a couple weeks. These all-star games, the NFL-PA game, the East-West Shrine game, and the Senior Bowl. Was out there with some clients. Saw some Canes out there as well. So we'll get into all that. But excited to be back here, man. There's been a lot going on in the Canes world.
Yeah, definitely excited to be back. Feels like forever. The fans have been missing the crotch wide shot, getting tired of the Miami Beach studios, wanted to switch it up, get something a little more professional. So happy to be back, and I know you got a lot to talk about from your journey.
Yeah, man, it was a good trip. Was out in LA for like I said, the first game was the NFL-PA game. So I think there was four Canes out there. Lou Headley as well. So Lou Headley was there, Mitchell Agude, DJ Ivy, DJ Scaife. We're all out there. We had a couple clients out there as well. Then there was the East-West Shrine game. And then the Senior Bowl, obviously, Tyrique Stevenson and Will Mallory were out there. So we'll get into that, now in a bit. But Lance Guidry, the new defensive coordinator, obviously not a name that was mentioned a lot when you talk about these articles that come out and stuff on social media, right? So some of these hires have kind of been out of nowhere, so to speak, for Mario. And I know you did the pod yesterday. You guys can go check it out. You did that with Lance Rofers. So obviously, if you want D-Money's full thoughts, go check that out. But for those who haven't had a chance to listen to it, what are your brief thoughts on that hire?
Yeah, well, you mentioned it came out of nowhere. It was said on the bank last week, I know what I don't know. I spoke to someone very much plugged in, and they said this is a very secretive process. And, of course, the first name that leaked from the coordinator side was someone that no one had mentioned. So that's how the search is going. Like you mentioned, me and Lance yesterday did a kind of X's and O's type of breakdown of Guidry on film. Did a little more digging, spoke to some people that know Guidry very, very well. I know you've spoken to scouts and people in that world, the non-UM world, about Guidry's reputation. So try to compile a little more information that's not necessarily in yesterday's podcast, which is more of a technical X's and O's podcast. Speaking as someone who's known Guidry for a long, long time, message I got was, this guy comes with an edge in a good way, just a different personality than maybe we've had at Miami.
You saw that in the video that kind of was going viral of him at Western Kentucky.
Oh, yeah, players love him, but a different kind of cat. He was compared to Manny Diaz in terms of both his philosophy of making plays behind the line of scrimmage and also trying to have fun. Turnover chain's a Manny thing, but that could have been a Guidry thing. He's that kind of guy. Probably the difference between Manny and Guidry, from what I understand talking to people, Guidry has more of a presence.
Mm-hmm.
He's a personality. He's that kind of guy that you feel him when he walks into a room. So a lot like Manny, but different in that way. And he had a quote that I loved it. I wanted to repeat it is, at the end of the play, either our band's going to be playing or their band's going to be playing, meaning big plays, turnovers, interceptions. They're out there to really disrupt with Guidry. And just a total Cane, old school Cane.
Right.
His first game as a head coach was McNeese State against that great 2000 Miami team. I was at that game. I'm sure a lot of our listeners were as well. So he knows what Miami can do. And I'm told that if it works out, and Miami plays well on defense, this is a guy that could be here for the long haul. He's not necessarily trying to be a head coach. He wants to be the defensive coordinator with a badass defense with great athletes, and he has that opportunity here in Miami. So what are some of the things you're hearing?
Yeah, so just talking to some people in the league, and obviously they have their pulse on some of these hires and coaching changes that go on. The overwhelming thing that I got is that he's very well respected in the coaching community, right? So you mentioned that he's a guy who does have an edge to him. Sometimes that can be perceived in the coaching community as a gimmicky sort of thing, right? That's not the case with him. He's a guy who has worked his way up, right? Was a high school coach, grinded his way to get where he is now, and the people at Tulane were pretty bummed out to hear, because he, how long was he there? A couple of days, right? So the people at Tulane were very, very bummed out to hear that, they were going to be losing him because that's how excited they were about it. He's a guy that obviously, again, you talked about the X's and O's in the podcast with Lance, but again, the yards per play and the per play numbers defensively were very very impressive last year, and that's kind of been the case of some of his other stops as well. But like I said, very well respected in the coaching community, which, that goes a long way when you're talking about building a staff. And I think what you mentioned is very important because, you saw what happened today. Charlie Strong leaves. There's been some other, movement on staff as well. But if you're looking at a guy who could be here for the long haul, that's a cornerstone piece to the staff, which did you ever really think that Kevin Steele was going to be here, with as much as he moved around, right? So, it could be more than just the 1 year, 2 year hire. It could be something that's a culture building hire as well.
Yeah, and I know because I know you, but people who are listening, Pete's getting this information from people that aren't at UM.
Right.
Scouts, talking about people in the coaching world, people that are looking at this from the outside in, and it's just been same thing I'm getting, which is unanimous. I don't say praise, but really people are excited to see how it plays out, and they think it's an interesting move, and they like the guy. One thing X's and O's wise I didn't mention with Lance, Guidry's known for that kind of old school Buddy Ryan bear front. He likes to get guys one-on-one where you have 5 guys for the 5 offensive linemen, one-on-one matchups across the board, and then having deception out of that where you don't know who's going to drop. You're going to show something and do the other thing. You might play some games where you think you're one-on-one with somebody, and then there's movement up front, there's a twist, and something else happens. You got to deal with that. It's going to be, when you talk about names like Buddy Ryan, that gets you excited about what this defense might look like from an aggression standpoint. So
I would think a guy like Mesidor, who I was talking to a scout about him today, who said, he's definitely a guy who could be a top 100 type pick next year. Probably could have gotten drafted, decently high this year as well if he decided to come out. But obviously the NIL stuff I think has changed a lot of the perspectives for some of these guys who, they could come out and be draft picks. But we've talked about this before. But a guy like Mesidor, I think that he's probably going to put up some pretty big numbers this year. And then Leonard Taylor as well. But those two come to mind right off the bat.
No, absolutely. And again, check out yesterday's podcast with Lance Roffers, a little more detailed X's and O's breakdown. But wanted to give you some more things we're hearing about Guidry from others, and not just our eyes. These are other people who do this for a living and have strong thoughts about Guidry. So, Pete, obviously you weren't here. You were traveling. You were at these bowl games. You were up close and personal with one of your clients, Tyrique Stevenson, at the Senior Bowl, also Will Mallory. What are some of the things that you heard and saw regarding these Canes that are trying to go to the next level?
Yeah, both of those guys had really good weeks. Obviously, they're in a little bit of different situations, each of them. But Tyrique, he really helped himself. Not only, people saw some of the clips from the one-on-ones and how he was dominating physically out there, a lot of these receivers. And at the end of the day, he came in there in really, really good shape. I forget I think he came in at just over 200 pounds, which probably was playing the season maybe 10 pounds heavier. So I think that, obviously he's a naturally bigger defensive back, right? A cornerback to be exact, right? But at the same time, I think his fluidity was on display with as physical as he was able to play, right? But with him, it wasn't just the on-the-field stuff. The interview process went really well for him out there. Obviously, a guy who has transferred schools. He's always going to have to answer questions about what happened there. What did you learn in that process coming over to Miami? And then he was here for a couple years. So, what was the difference between the coaching staff? That's all the sort of, questions that he needed to answer out there. And the overwhelming response was that he did a very, very good job in that portion of it. So, look, going into the Senior Bowl already, I think had a very good chance based on what we'd been hearing of being a top 100 pick. But I think solidified himself as a top 50 pick with a solid chance now moving forward with pro day and the combine, obviously the testing is going to kind of determine how a lot of these guys at each position kind of get slotted. But as long as he goes out there and confirms what we already know about him being an explosive guy who we expect to test well. And when I say we, it's not like, us at the agency. I'm talking about the scouts and what they see, right? Because a lot of it is just confirming what they see on film, right? So he goes out there and runs, four low to mid 4.4s. That's probably what a lot of these scouts are already seeing. He just confirms that. You go out there and run something, in the 4.3s, then that's where he can, really go a lot higher than anyone probably thought when this process begun, right? So, and the thing about him, that we were just talking about it before the show too, is that there are some teams I think he could be a top 10 type cornerback in the NFL. There's also some teams that look at him as a guy you can match up with tight ends, with different, bigger receivers in the slot. You can move him around as that chess piece, the way that the Rams do with Jalen Ramsey. So when you have some teams who value him as high as they do as a corner, and then some teams think he can play that safety nickel role, which has become increasingly important in the league now with the way that these offenses are being run. When you have that much value and bring that much to the table, half the team may look at him as strictly as a cornerback, and half the team is going to look at him as that guy they move around, right? But that's where he's pushing the ability to become, a solidified first round pick.
Yeah. I mean, we've been saying on the podcast since the beginning, since before he was anywhere near, your client, that this guy was the best NFL prospect on the team. Not surprised. Kind of reminds you of Artie Burns in terms of Miami fans liked him, but they didn't think he was a first.
Well, and that's what I see it on social media. Everyone's kind of surprised by it, and I understand that aspect of it, but from the physical standpoint, and again, you got to look at what else is in the class. It's not the strongest corner class, out there. He's in a very good position because, the way these teams look is they look at the athlete, and obviously the mental side of it goes into what their ceiling could become and the coachability and all that. But in terms of the clay that you can mold with, that is Tyrique, he gets some good development at the next level, and he's going to be an all-pro.
And he's a tackler. I mean, he's physical. He makes you a tougher team when you pick him. You don't have to worry about that aspect.
That was one of the things we heard of the Senior Bowl was, there was a 3x2 drill where, basically they had to read if it was going to be a bubble, and if it was going to be a bubble, they had to go shoot and make the tackle. And a couple scouts just said, man, in that drill you could hear his pop, and you could almost feel it, and it's they're padded, but it's still an all-star practice at the end of the day. So just in those little moments, he was impressive. So he checked pretty much all the boxes out there. He went down, I think it was the late in the second day of practice, or the third. I figured it was the second or third day. He missed a day of practice out there, and then obviously played in the game, but had pulled his hamstring, had tightened up. So, but he was okay. Ended up getting out to the next day and playing. But other than that, it was pretty much an A+ week for him.
Yeah, there was like a play where it was a tackle. They ended up grabbing the guy's neck. It looked like in the game, It looked like he was going to do like the old Rude Awakening from Ravishing Rick Rude. I know it's a little before your time.
Yeah, that definitely don't fully understand the reference, but I know the play you're talking about.
But I think usually there's a corner run between 20 and 30. My guess is he goes in that range.
Agreed.
That'd be my prediction. Will Mallory, probably second half of day 3, round 6 and 7. You think that's accurate?
Yeah, so good week for him. It's just with him, it's the injury concern, right? Obviously, we saw what he was when he came into Miami. I think still is going to be a guy that makes it in the league and is going to bring value to someone as a number 2, number 3 tight end. But can he stay healthy is going to be the team's biggest concerns. Obviously, we hope that he has a healthy long career. And I think he's going to be able to find a niche. But that's why when you talk about his value, where it maybe once was a bit higher, it's just those are the questions that they're going to have to. And a lot of that stuff gets figured out when he does the medical check at the combine and maybe, throughout pro day and stuff like that. But, hopefully most teams keep him, give him the green arrow to be a draft pick, and that stuff doesn't scare too many people away. But that's where he's at, definitely.
Oh, I'm curious to see him in the combine too, because this guy can run.
Mm-hmm.
He was a track guy in high school. I think he was like either 10.9 or close to it. So,
That was some pounds ago. Natural pound. I'm not saying he's overweight, but what I'm saying is he was also a much leaner version of himself. And again, the injuries, that's what some of these people in the league have hypothesized, that the injuries have slowed him down a bit. But that's where, again, if that's what their concern is, he goes out there and tests better than what they're expecting. That will force people to go back and look at the tape and say, man, he looked a lot better freshman, sophomore year, the way he was moving around at least. If we can get him back healthy, maybe we have something. So that's where the value comes into play for a team with him.
So part of your journey is you've been speaking to folks about our current personnel, the current Miami Hurricanes, including recruits and also guys we're bringing in from the portal. What have you heard from scouts about Matt Lee, the center from UCF?
Yeah, so very interesting with him, because obviously the center's not the sexiest position out there. And we have discussed, what he's going to mean to the team. But I had one scout tell me that the upgrade that you're getting with him from a body and from an athleticism standpoint over what Miami, had previously is huge, right? And when you look at the center, he's a guy who could get drafted for sure next year, right? But when you look at the center position and you look at what Miami's trying to do offensive line-wise, this scout told me, look, the center position is the one that really sets the tone for the offensive line. There's going to be a lot of shuffling around, a lot of changes on this line from last year, and we understand that that's got to be the position that probably takes, one of the biggest leaps on the team, if not the biggest. We expect them to have the bodies, but there's going to be a lot of moving parts there. So that acquisition at center is about as big as anything Miami's done this offseason. Obviously, you have Cohen coming in. You have, some of these young guys. But, again, the upgrade you're getting from a body and an athleticism standpoint at that position is huge with Matt Lee.
Yeah, when I watched the film on Lee, I expected this G5, so I expected a smaller guy, maybe a technician, a scrappy guy, decent athlete. He's big and he's strong. He was pushing people and he was anchoring up. We'll see how that translates to P5, but I was very surprised by that. And like you mentioned, the identity that Mario wants. If you have a center that's moving people and is holding his ground like this guy did on tape in G5, that's going to set the tone, especially when you got these monsters next to him, including a couple guys that you spoke to somebody about at the Hula Bowl.
So I was at the NFLPA Bowl in LA. We had a couple clients out there, Mikkel Jones from Syracuse, who is a Miami guy, had an awesome career up there at Syracuse at inside linebacker, and Steven Jones from App State, nickel corner, who has a very good chance to get drafted. It was pretty much the defensive MVP of that game. But guy coaching the defensive lineman for one of the teams out there was Domata Pecco. I think it's Pecco. I don't know if it's Pecco or Pico, but I think it's Pecco. Former NFL defensive lineman, played for a handful of teams. I know he played for the Bengals as well. But he was coaching. He lives in LA now, pulled up with his Rolls Royce right to the front of the Rose Bowl every day of practice. But awesome dude. I actually recognized that Frankie Tinilau and Francis Malgo had been posting with him the week before because he was coaching, I guess, at the Polynesian Bowl that they were at in Hawaii. And I guess because his son played with Frankie in California when Frankie was there for the year, or for that short period of time that he was over there. But I went up to him, introduced myself, and said, hey, I saw you out there with a couple guys last week that are going to Miami. He said, how do you know about them? I said, and I kind of gave him the background. He said, man, those two guys, talking about Frankie Tinilau and Francis Malgo, he said, those two guys are future first-round picks. They're the total package. Great kids, in terms of coachability, was the number one thing he was talking about with them. And physically, they're monsters, So he was singing those guys' praises, trying to see if we get him on the show to get him to talk a little bit more in depth about those guys. But he was just blown away, and he knew Frankie a little bit from his time in California with his son. But he said, "Oh man, Miami's getting a couple good ones in them." So he said Miami's going to be dangerous recruiting the Polynesians for sure. He said that you get a couple of those guys, and we've talked about it, the pipeline that they're trying to build, right? And it's going to be fun to see them continue to do that on a year in, year out basis.
Switching gears real quick to the most successful team in Miami Hurricanes basketball. Coach L, great week, beat Clemson, a very good Clemson team, beat a Duke team that's down but beat the hell out of them, which Miami has done a lot. It's like bizarre world. We're going to
awesome crowd the other night. I was out there, and obviously the Dukes of the world always bring out the Dukes and the Carolinas always bring out the biggest crowds, but it's not like this is a top 10 Duke team this year, right? It's not, Coach K is not there anymore, so it's not quite the same luster, I feel like. But man, the student section was amazing, and I was talking to one of my guys, Anthony Walker, who we work with on the NIL side, and he was just telling me that the energy from the students was, that was probably the best game that he said he'd been a part of in terms of the atmosphere there. And they got Louisville this Saturday coming up. Clemson still has a game lead in the ACC, but Miami does have that win over them. So let's see how it plays out. Right now, the biggest thing that I'm seeing is obviously, we talked about this a few weeks ago, the presence that Omier brings to the floor. Right, you have Duke has some 6'11", 7-footers on that team, and Miami pretty much set the tone right away. Duke from the first possession tried to go inside, and they couldn't get anything going. And then, Omier did what he's been doing. Jordan Miller, who is probably I'm gonna not even say probably, I'm gonna say is the most complete player on the team. You heard Coach L in an interview the other day say that he's the most underrated player in the conference. I would agree with that. And Wong, what he's going to bring you pretty much every night. Pack starting to really come into his own. I think again, people forget that at Kansas State, he was really more of a shooting guard, a shoot first player. You have Miami last year, the offense, Charlie Moore was a guy who was a facilitator first. The offense, flowed really well with him, running things. So you bring in a guy in Pack, you have two ball-dominant guys in Pack and Wong. It was going to take a little bit of time. And it's not like they struggled early. They got off to a good start, right? But I think now you're really starting to see things mesh for them offensively because Pack is kind of finding that balance of when to shoot, when to facilitate. And then the depth is game by game. You get guys like Bensley Joseph, Harlan Beverly continuing to step up and fill important roles on this team.
And Wooga, I thought he's been playing a lot better.
He's taken the biggest step. His confidence is through the roof. I mean, he looks like an NBA type athlete and body, right? But remember, that's a guy who has experience, played some minutes, didn't have the best performance, but against Kansas last year, right? In the Elite Eight, you're bringing back a lot of tournament experience. Even if a guy like Omier wasn't here last year and Pack wasn't on this team, the Wongs of the world, Jordan Miller, Anthony Walker, Beverly was on that team last year. He, was injured, but this is going to be a dangerous team moving forward.
Yeah, to me.
And sorry to cut you off, but it's not your typical ACC year where they're getting beat up and knock on wood, that nothing happens, but they've been relatively healthy. And again, it's not that same ACC where every game is a grueling battle. They've had a bunch of close games, but it's not that same war of attrition as it sometimes might be. So I think that could bode well for them, late into March and April.
Well, something you touched on that I'm really focused on, actually two things you mentioned. Number one, the dynamic between Pack and Wong. And then number two, there's been a lot of blowouts when Miami's won. When Miami's lost, there have been close games. Mm-hmm. That tells you that Miami's a good team, that they're losing close, winning big. But my concern is when you get to these tournament games that come down to a couple possessions, how is that dynamic of Wong versus and Pack going to play out? You had Charlie Moore, unquestioned leader in the past. Usually, all the really good Miami teams, whether it's McClinton or Larkin, Moore, Angel Rodriguez, you kind of know who has the ball at the end. Who's going to have the ball here? I personally would rather have Wong on the ball.
And they've tried that a couple times late in games. I don't know if the movement around the ball was where it needed to be, but I don't know. I also don't know what the play was. I don't know if it was an ISO call, right? But I agree.
The Pittsburgh game where it kind of fell
right,
apart.
Right. So and then there was another game. If I remember correctly, that had happened. It may not have been recently, but you're right. That's going to be an interesting dynamic. Personally, I like Jordan Miller with the ball in his hands too, because I think he's the guy who's going to make the smart basketball decision. And you see him in transition. He's really awesome as a facilitator in transition. It just always seems like he's making the right play. So maybe run something through him because he can shoot it. He can get to the hoop. He can finish with either hand. And like I said, he's going to make the right play. So if someone's open, right, then he's a guy who definitely I would trust with the ball, in his hands at the end of the game.
So fill up the Watsco, go on CanesInSight. I got the basketball board rolling, and get excited about this team because it is the best team in town.
Yeah, and it's listen, I think they're not going to sneak up on people this year either. At least locally, I think there's more buzz about this team right now than there was, because the team last year I don't think was ranked at all, if I remember correctly last year. I think a lot of people here knew that they were built for a run, but they're getting some media attention, some buzz, which this is awesome. Coach O has been consistently bringing in top 25 type classes. If you can start to make that a top 15, top 20 class, and every year just move it up a little bit, but all this stuff plays into it. Like I said, they're not going to sneak up on anybody this year, but I think very much like last year, they're built for it. I'm not too concerned about running into a team that's going to, quote unquote, eat you up inside unless they're playing Purdue. But Miami's very, just like you would be concerned about a big man or a post presence. A lot of teams are concerned about what they have to do when it comes to Miami's trapping and their speed on the defensive side of the ball.
It's like the Warriors and the NBA or the old Chicago Bulls with Jordan. You don't have to be huge to be a defensive team. You have got a lot of guys that are the same size. I should say with the Bill Cartwright teams before you were even born. A lot of guys the same size, a lot of guys with quickness, and they're physical. Virginia, most physical team on their schedule. I thought they matched a blow for blow. So it'll be a fun team to watch. Very similar in my view to what he did at George Mason when he went to the Final Four, as far
Definitely.
as the buildup of the team. So
listen, I would love to see them. This is my last thing I'll say. I would love to see them, run the table here at the end and go get a regular season ACC championship like they did in 2013. To me, that's a huge accomplishment. Look, anyone can get hot and win a tournament, but to say that you were the best team for the course of that season, like I said, it's not the same ACC, but UVA is still a top 10, top 15 team this year. Carolina hasn't played all that well, but we know that they have the ability to go on a run as well. So,
and they said that last year about the ACC, and then you go to the tournament and who actually advanced.
Right, so. Exactly. So,
no, looking forward to it. All right, we got an episode of The Bank coming up next. First, a word from our buddies at Gaineswear. Whether it's in the FRM studio, the Miami Beach studio, it is always about Caneswear, the spot where Miami fans shop. the number one place for all kinds of apparel for all your Miami teams, whether it's the Heat, the Hurricanes, the Marlins, the Panthers, United, doesn't matter. They got it. My favorite product they put out in years, the Lady Canes starter jacket. Get it for your wife, $129.95. Just a beautiful piece of work. Fits great, looks great. Still a little chilly outside. Get the jacket. Valentine's Day, just for any kind of surprise, you will be popular because it looks that good. Also, the Super Bowl square contest. You got the Super Bowl this Sunday. Buy a square with Caneswear. $10. You can win a $50 Caneswear gift certificate, and all the proceeds go to the Miami Dolphins Cancer Challenge. So, whether it's supporting the community, supporting your team, Caneswear.com or the brick and mortar store in Davie, it's all there at the Spot Miami Fan Shop, Caneswear. All right, it's time for The Bank, brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Sign up, promo code CIS. You get $200 free to play right away. Super Bowl's on Sunday. They got all kinds of over-unders and games to play with the Super Bowl. You want to get some action on that game, $200 right in your pocket just for using promo code CIS. Also, daily fantasy drafts, you name it. Underdogs Fantasy is the place to be. Promo code CIS and get hooked up. All right, last week I had a loaded bank. I wanted to just clean up on a couple things and bring some new information to the table about the class of 2024. One thing I wanted to emphasize is, this is my own observations, but information I'm also gathering, which is the class in South Florida this year is lacking some big-time players. That doesn't mean people won't emerge. You saw Chris Johnson, Stanquan Clark have great senior years and become those big-time prospects. But right now, South Florida is a bit lacking. So when you see Miami really focus on what they consider the priority targets and the studs, you're going to see a major national flair to what they do. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to recruit these Chaminade kids like crazy, or a guy like Chris Wheatley-Humphrey, the running back out of Dillard with extraordinary speed, or a guy like Ricky Knight out of Benjamin. They're identifying big-time players locally. There's just not as many as you may have seen in the past, like a class of 2021, for example, or even last year. So that's something to watch, the national flavor of this class, at least in these early stages. Now, Lynn D., a poster on CanesInSight, has compiled a list of the big board for various positions, and very comprehensive. If you're on CanesInSight forums, check them out. You're going to get a ton of names that really summarize the guys Miami's after. But I wanted to focus on a few names that maybe are lower rated, not getting talked about a lot, but are guys that I know that Miami has a lot of interest in. These aren't necessarily imminent commits or anything like that. These are just guys that aren't getting talked about right now that Miami likes a lot, and I wanted to bring to your attention. So, with that, talking about a guy like Kevin Riley, a running back from Alabama. You say, Alabama recruit. That's going to be tough to beat out the local schools. But when you watch the NFL draft, NFL players are leaving Alabama all the time. It's one of the top states for producing players, and they don't all go to the University of Alabama or Auburn. So keep an eye on a guy like Kevin Riley, running back out of Tuscaloosa. Kevin Smith, the running back coach, has landed big-time players out of Alabama to places like FAU and Ole Miss. So he's one to watch. Max LeBlanc, who's a no-star tight end out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. He's someone to keep an eye on as an emerging player that Miami likes at that position. DeBron Gatling, Texas A&M commit, Milton, Georgia wide receiver, teammate of Aaron Noland, another guy Miami likes a lot that's not getting a lot of buzz on the Miami boards. Daniel Cruz, offensive lineman out of Richland, Texas, 3-star guy, but is getting some big-time interest. Miami's among those teams interested in him. And you know what Miami does at offensive line. They tend to zero in and do a great job on their targets. Darian Mayo, 6'7", big defensive end out of Baltimore. He's someone that's another 3-star guy that doesn't get the attention, but is someone to watch. Edwin Spillman, a linebacker out of Tennessee. He came down, really liked what he saw, and Miami liked what they saw in him. Someone to keep an eye on, a linebacker. Kalaj Cobbins, linebacker out of Destrehan, Louisiana. That's Ed Reed's old school. Will be a tough pull, but he's someone that Miami likes a lot. Khalil Cummings, spelled Chalil, a cornerback out of Stark, Florida. FSU's pushing really hard for him. He's another 3-star guy, but I think he's someone who's rising. Keep an eye on that player. And then Isaiah Thomas, safety out of Clearwater, a Canadian. Clearwater has been bringing in Canadian players to train up to the next level, and players from all over Sweden. You saw Lucas Simmons, who went to FSU last year, Akeem Mesidor, of course, Miami Hurricane. So keep an eye on Isaiah Thomas, not the point guard, but the big safety out of Clearwater as another guy that Miami likes. Portal wide receiver, I mentioned last week, Miami wants to take 2. It's hard to get information on the portal from the schools because they're limited to whoever's in the portal, and right now there's not that many people still left. But talking to people in the NIL agent world, I'm hearing that there are multiple big-time receivers that are unhappy and that are very likely to jump in the portal after the spring. So I can't really say the names, but if these names do jump in the portal, I am positive these are guys that Miami is going to be very, very interested in just because they fit the profile of what Miami's looking for and what they need. So expect a lot of action in the portal at the wide receiver position. If these agents are telling me the truth, and they tend to have a good pulse on who's going to jump. I heard from one of those guys that Cohen was unhappy before he jumped in the portal, ultimately went to Miami. So there's guys that are not too happy with their current situation. They're still rolling out the spring, but they could jump in the portal. That post-spring portal, you're not going to make your whole team or your whole portal class post-spring, but if you can get a few select guys that can put you over the top, and that's what Miami needs at the wide receiver position and at the big defensive tackle position. Keep an eye on those spots, but particularly at wide receiver. Miami would love to add some speed and some explosiveness at that position, some playmaking, a number 1 type of guy, and there's multiple guys that are unhappy with their current situations, and you never know what could happen. So stay tuned. CanesInSight, keep refreshing those forums, and there's going to be information rolling all the way through till spring starts in March, and the recruiting really, really picks up. So know where to go, CanesInsight.com, the best in the business.